Welcome to this presentation on ethics provided by the Texas Board of Professional Geoscientists. This presentation will focus on what honesty, integrity, and accountability mean, and I've included some case studies. I've also included a little information about Texas ethics regulations and a summary of the TBPG Code of Conduct that highlights real that many of you found useful from the last ethics presentation that I did. So ethics is a set of values that define and direct us to the right choice. Sometimes our personal morals and belief system coincide with our professional ethics, and sometimes they don't. Generally, our morals really guide our own personal behavior without significant consideration of others. Professional ethics, however, require you to consider the varying points of view of all involved. Generally, your personal ethics begin with knowing the difference between right and wrong. Your sense of right and wrong comes from your upbringing, religious beliefs, and societal customs. While we like to think of morals as altruistic, the definition does not preclude someone from having a moral code that says, hey, everybody should do what benefits me. Perhaps you've met or dealt with someone like that. It can be quite the challenge. Your professional ethics are generally congruent with your industry. What would your colleagues or competitors do? Is your course of action similar to what your colleagues would do? What is in the best interest of all parties involved? What happens when what's best for your client isn't necessarily best for you? What if what's best for you and your client doesn't exactly align with regulations? Your personal moral code may be insufficient to handle tricky professional dilemmas. Remember that having a personal moral code is not a legal requirement, nor should it be. But again, our societal sense of right and wrong is strongly reflected in our regulations. Many licensing entities require you to be of sound moral character. A recent survey of college students viewed ethics training as simply another hurdle to get their degree. Perhaps more importantly, they didn't view ethics as applicable to their profession. They also felt it was unnecessary to study ethics since they were already ethical people. From last year's presentation, we saw a study that said 61% of college students admitted to cheating and 85% thought cheating was essential. Are these the same students who find it unnecessary to study ethics? A recent study found that conflicts between personal and professional ethics are on the rise, primarily due to job stability and advancement, and the boundaries between private choices versus business choices. 64% of those polled stated that the conflicts are due to religious beliefs. Let's look at a few examples. What if you're a police officer sworn to uphold the law, but you personally believe the law is wrong? Can you separate your personal beliefs from your job? Who would be hurt if you chose not to enforce this particular law? Is the law discriminatory and that's why you think it's wrong? We are bombarded by movies and television with examples of police deciding which laws to enforce and which to ignore. Often, the characters are shown as heroes when they choose to ignore a law that they think is wrong. At what point should we change the law if it's wrong, rather than putting police in these difficult situations? What if you're a psychotherapist and your client has committed many crimes? You have very strong moral views on these crimes. Do you have a professional obligation to treat this client? Can you provide the best treatment for this client? Can you maintain patient-client confidentiality? What are the legal obligations to report? And what does your professional code of conduct require you to do? In a recent news story, the mayor of a Texas city requested that only males lead prayers before city meetings. What are the myriad of potential issues? Separation of church and state? Are the prayers mandatory by city code? What are the implications of the policy that is not inclusive of all genders? Is this request actually legal? Has the mayor previously prohibited anyone from leading a prayer? Or has the mayor declared a specific religion that must lead the prayer? In a widely publicized medical case, the husband of a patient chose a course of action for his wife that conflicted with the parents' wishes. The parents sued to block his choice. The questions are many. Who had the legal authority to decide? Who has the medical power of attorney? Did the doctors agree with the husband or the parents? Did the legal battles prolong suffering? Did the husband's decision violate the religious beliefs of the parents or the wife? Was the husband's decision legal? These are all difficult examples that can easily blur the lines between personal morality and professional obligation. Did you snap to judgment on these? Or did you stop to consider all the views of all the parties involved? Was one of these more difficult than another? Next, I'd like to move into a few definitions. Honesty, integrity, accountability, and fidelity. And I really like this quote. Honesty, the fastest way to prevent a mistake from turning into a failure. So what does honesty mean to you? Is it simply that you don't tell a lie? What if telling the whole truth will hurt someone? Is it speaking and acting truthfully? Is it admitting to your actions? Or is it simply acting in accordance with your morals? Taking this a step farther, is omission dishonest? What if leaving out a few details could spare someone's feelings? What about skimming over a few facts to lessen a blow? Where do you personally draw the line for honesty? How many of us have been on a cell phone call and pretended that the other party is breaking up so you can get off the phone? We've all seen the definition of integrity many times, doing the right thing even when no one is watching. But what does integrity mean to you? Is it being able to look yourself in the mirror, being trustworthy or transparent or reliable or consistent? Or is it the old saying, I say what I do and do what I say? Or is it the ability to do the right thing even when it isn't the most beneficial to you? And what is the opposite of integrity? Is it compartmentalization, where you're trustworthy in one place and not in another? Can you really keep a part of your life separate from the rest? Are you one way with some people and different with others? What about saying one thing and doing another? Do hidden agendas equal this compartmentalization or a lack of integrity? How many times have you personally thought, who would ever know? What choice did you make when you thought no one would find out? And that leads us into the definition of accountability. You can find all kinds of definitions for accountability, but I particularly liked this one. It is the glue that ties commitment to the result. But what does accountability mean to you? Is it responsibility or answering for your responsibilities? Is it being true to your word? Is it the willingness to accept responsibility for your actions? Is it following through on commitments? We tend to think of accountability in terms of results. If we achieve the end result, then we were accountable for it. But what's the opposite of accountability? Is it shame or regret? Does shame or guilt mean that you avoided being accountable? Does a lack of accountability have a consequence? Is that consequence punitive to you or to someone else? And why does the phrase being held accountable have such a negative connotation in society? How many movies have you seen where someone is threatened with the phrase, I'm holding you accountable? The reality is that we use accountability as a measure of job performance, and often only for the negative outcomes. Just imagine if we were held accountable for all those positive job performances too. And that leads us into the discussion of fidelity. True happiness is not attained through self-gratification, but through fidelity to a worthy purpose. Is it true that we are at our happiest when we are seeing through those things that we hold most dear? We don't hear the word fidelity much in business, at least not as much as we hear honesty, integrity, and accountability, which is why I included it today. So what does fidelity mean to you? Is it being faithful, loyal, or steadfast? If so, to what? Adherence to what we think is right? Is it fulfilling obligations? Is it simply allegiance to another person or entity? And can we have fidelity without trust? Can we be loyal to those who are disloyal to us? Is it necessary to test the actions of others over time to develop fidelity? The majority of the time, we think of fidelity as it relates to marriage, but does it not also apply to our professional life? Do we not have fidelity with our employer? If you own a business, do you have fidelity with your employees? What about fidelity to clients? What about fidelity to science in general? That's why I felt like it was important to include it in our discussion of ethics. Again, you can't have ethics without honesty, integrity, accountability, and fidelity. Most professions agree that these are necessary. So much so that most licensed professions have some sort of ethics standard. These ethical standards encourage professionals to adhere to applicable laws, current best practices, and generally accepted industry standards while performing their duties with diligence and honesty. Additionally, they require you to maintain confidentiality where required, refrain from conflicts of interest, and not damage the reputations of colleagues, clients, or employers. We normally see ethics training directed at employees, and quite honestly, that's the best place to start. But we cannot stop there. Ethical standards must apply to all professions. I mean your boss's boss, and the company owner too. If we want an ethics-driven business that creates customer loyalty, then the managers and owners must be the role models. They must emulate the 4 characteristics of ethics that we've discussed today. Honesty, being ethical and honest at all times. Integrity, telling the truth, not hiding or manipulating information for their benefit. Accountability, admitting mistakes and failures rather than covering them up. Fidelity, rewarding ethical employees and punishing unethical behavior, and protecting whistleblowers who bring unethical behavior to light. Does your company have a written ethics policy? More importantly, have you actually read it? How did they define misconduct? What are the internal procedures if someone is accused of an ethics violation? Is there a formal complaint system or a non-threatening way for employees to raise questions and concerns? I see companies failing or flailing at this because of one or more of the following. Failing to empathize with the anxiety surrounding a complaint, jumping to a premature conclusion, failing to thoroughly investigate, promising results in an unrealistic time frame, promising results and never delivering, failing to give a simple apology for what has apparently happened or the apparent impact, losing compassion and replacing it with legalese, giving false reassurances or hinting at outcomes, and being careless with confidential information. So, why do so many companies and employees alike fail at ethics? It usually comes down to rationalizing the need to demonstrate honesty, integrity, accountability, and fidelity. The most common thing I hear is business, followed by kill or be killed or hit or be hit. These are euphemisms to justify the pursuit of corporate or personal gain. But we also see divided loyalties. What's best for you versus the other party? Those slippery slopes. Crossing this boundary is okay, but crossing that one isn't. Does crossing one boundary lead to crossing others? Placing profits ahead of ethics? The old, it's not really illegal. And lastly, the ethical dilemma of corporate values that differ from your own. If we go back to the 4 characteristics, we see some examples of rationalizations either for or against ethical behavior. Something like, it's okay to lie to spare someone's feelings. Or, I made a mistake, even though no one will ever know, I have to admit it. Or, I said I would do it, and I will. Or, the company needs me to win this, but I know we don't have the staff to do the work. Psychologists have studied the rationalizations behind ethical issues and developed something called the intensity model for determining the harm that might be caused by unethical behavior. Basically, you are more likely to rationalize unethical behavior based on the perceived relevance or importance of an issue. Sounds kind of like what college students do about cheating, right? Let's start at the top. You must first have some kind of consensus that the action is wrong. You may rely on your personal values, or you may need corroboration from colleagues, friends, or family. Next, you look at how likely the action is to cause harm. If there is little to none, you are more likely to do it. Next, how immediate is that harm? If the harm doesn't happen for years, you're much more likely to do it. Next is proximity to the victims. Do you know them? Are they close to you? If so, you're less likely to behave unethically. But if they are strangers or competitors, you might. Then, how concentrated is the effect? If that effect is diluted across many locations or many people, that lessens the severity in your mind and makes you more likely to rationalize. All of that then adds up to how much harm will be caused. This is the ultimate question that most people ask themselves when considering their potentially unethical actions. So, when you are first looking at ethical decision making, we have a flowchart to follow. You have to define the problem, gather the facts, and the information necessary for you to properly assess. Then you need to identify the potential solutions and their potential impacts. Next, you identify the potential consequences of each solution. What values would be respected or violated? Then comes the harm. That's where the intensity model is really enacted. How much harm would ensue? Would it be just negative publicity? Or is it something that's legally defensible? And then, of course, we have NIMBY, not in my backyard. Ultimately, you ask yourself if you could live with it. You may even seek opinions or verifications. What would my colleagues, friends, or family say? What does my profession say? What does my licensing agency say? And what would my company or organization say? Let's look at a couple of examples through the intensity model. The first example is robbing a bank with a gun. Well, is it wrong? I think we all agree it's illegal, but you are going to lose your house without the money. So, what's the likely harm caused? You don't plan to shoot the gun, you'll just use it to scare people. Is there immediate harm? Well, it'll only take a few weeks for the people to get their money back from the federal insurance. As far as proximity, you chose a small town where no one knows you, and more importantly, you don't know them. And then the concentrated effect. It's a tiny amount of money for the bank, but it's huge for you. So ultimately, how much harm? Yeah, there's no real harm because the money's insured. And there's your rationalization. Now, let's look at avoiding giving bad news to a client. Is it wrong? It's not illegal, but they are expecting to speak to you. What's the likely harm? They may spend more money than necessary if you don't tell them soon. Is it immediate harm? No, but you can't avoid it for long. They have to know by tomorrow. Proximity? It's a good client, so you have to be really careful. The concentrated effect? It's going to kill the deal for them, and they were really counting on this deal. So how much harm? The client has already spent a lot of money on this deal, including your fees, and now it's all going to be for nothing. So once again, we wind up with rationales for unethical behavior. It's not really illegal. My behavior is in everyone's best interest. Nobody will ever find out what I've done. And then the favorite, when in Rome. And speaking of when in Rome, what if a local standard condones bribes and kickbacks? World Bank says that roughly 1/3 of firms around the world use kickbacks to the tune of 400 billion, and that's billion with a B, per year. What if the local standards ignore environmental damage? Should you follow what the country does or what you know is best? These ethical dilemmas force you to ask yourself, what would a reasonable and prudent person do in the same or similar circumstance? You must also ask yourself, what constitutes misconduct with my employer or my license? What are the internal procedures for my situation? Is there a formal process for a corporate decision rather than leaving it up to just me? So next, I'd like to move on to a few relevant case studies. We're all tired of hearing about COVID-19, but there was a few stock dump cases. So the first one, Senator Richard Burr sold 1.7 million in transactions in late January of 2020. Several were companies that own hotels. 2 weeks later, he predicted dire consequences from coronavirus, including cutbacks in company travel. He also called it a pandemic before the CDC did. The DOJ is still investigating because he has a direct hand in his investments, but they have not yet brought charges. And another COVID-19 stock dump. 3 other senators sold off substantial holdings just before the market drop. Kelly Loeffler, Senate Health Committee, and her husband is the chair of the New York Stock Exchange, sold 18.7 million starting on the day she attended a COVID-19 briefing, only 23 days after taking office. She stated that all transactions are carried out by a third-party blind trust. So the DOJ never charged her and they closed the investigation. Dianne Feinstein sold somewhere between 1.5 and 6 million in a biotech company between January 31st and February 18th of 2020. The Feinstein spokesman told the New York Times that the senator's assets are in a blind trust and that she has no involvement in her husband's financial decisions. The DOJ closed the investigation with no charges filed. And Jim Inhofe sold about $400,000 worth of stock on January 27th, including holdings in PayPal, Apple, and Brookfield Asset Management, a real estate company. Inhofe has not yet responded, but the DOJ closed the investigation with no charges filed. And yet another stock dump, but this one was pre-COVID. Former Representative Chris Collins was sentenced to 26 months in prison, but COVID delayed the start of his sentence until August 2020. He called his son from the White House and told him to sell all stock in a biotech company that they owned because the company failed a clinical drug trial. The failure wasn't made public for another 4 days. His son avoided $768,000 in losses when the failure was made public. Collins himself was not able to trade his shares and lost millions because the shares were still held by a transfer agent in Australia. Collins admitted to sharing non-public information with his son and was convicted on January 17th of 2020. For stock trading, government officials and lawmakers are often privy to key information not available to the public that could potentially be used to profit in the stock market. In 2012, Congress passed the Stock Act to prevent members of Congress from engaging in insider trading. Critics say it's riddled with loopholes. So let's move out of politics and into a few other examples. Okay. PG&E in Hinckley, California. How many of you know the Erin Brockovich story? PG&E contaminated a sole source drinking water aquifer with chromium-6. They had unlined ponds that were used for chromic wastewater since the 1950s. New laws went into effect in 76, and they lined those ponds in 79. They reported high levels of chromium-6 to the state in 1987. The concentrations were 10 times the safe level in drinking water. They began buying all the neighboring properties, and their own documents show internal scientists raised the issue in 1969. The case was won in 1996 by Ed Masry and Erin Brockovich. The total award was $333 million, which was the largest in history until the Deepwater Horizon. Here's another one with Roundup being labeled as a probable human carcinogen. In 2015, the World Health Organization, Internal Agency for Research on Cancer, said glyphosate probably causes cancer. In 2017, EPA said the herbicide is not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. In 2017, Bayer, who acquired Monsanto the next year, said that glyphosate is safe and efficient weed control. Also in 2017, a CNN report indicated that more than 800 people were suing Monsanto. In 2018, thousands more were suing Monsanto, and jurors gave $79 million to a man they say got cancer from Roundup. In 2019, a University of Washington researcher evaluated the existing glyphosate studies and found that the cancer risk of those exposed increased by 41%, specifically for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In 2019, Cynthia Curl, an environmental health scientist at Boise State, said, "Many assumptions have been made about the safety of glyphosate that are now being actively questioned. We will see an explosion of information about glyphosate, and it's about time. We're really playing catch up with this one." What about privately funded research? More and more research is privately funded as the National Science Foundation funding declines. So, can you trust Monsanto's research into the carcinogenicity of Roundup? What specifics might allow you to trust their research? What about duplicate studies conducted by more than one independent research lab? What about contracts with those labs that allow publication of the results without Monsanto's consent or approval? Would that be enough? Can you trust an oil company's assessment of climate impacts from fossil fuels? What specifics might allow you to trust that report? Is it proof of corporate investment in carbon sequestration technology? Or are there corroborating results from NSF-funded research from multiple climate scientists? Again, what kind of information would allow you to trust that report? Next, do professionals skew sampling strategies? Here's an example from a 25-year-old fast food site in West Texas. It was a gas station for 30 years prior to becoming a fast food site. A new purchaser wants to tear down the existing and build a different fast food restaurant on the site. The phase 1 recommended a phase 2, but obviously that phase 2 needed to be clean to obtain the financing. The environmental consultant completed 4 borings on a small property and submitted soil samples to a certified lab, and they never encountered groundwater. They issued a clean phase 2. The sample depths on the report looked appropriate, 10 to 15 feet below ground surface, but on the lab report, the sample depths indicated that they were only 2 feet deep. The site map was skewed to indicate that the borings were closer to the worst case locations than they actually were. Upon a site visit, the borings were actually placed at the far corners of the property, not anywhere near potential hotspots. Was this ethical? And engineering versus geoscience. A geotechnical firm sends you out to collect soil strength samples. No PG is required. You report back that you smell fuel or gasoline in these samples. Your boss says, since you're already there with the rig, collect some additional samples and we'll send them to a lab for analysis. And that lab, of course, finds fuel contamination. When the geotechnical report is issued, this information is included, but no PG signs or seals it. Your firm doesn't even have a PG on staff. Additionally, the report makes recommendations for spacing of foundation piers for a new commercial building. The report does not include an engineer's signature or seal either. What are the potential violations? How do you handle this? It appears that they did both geoscience and engineering without either seal. An expert witness is hired for their specialized training, education, skill, and experience. They are generally hired to review data, draw conclusions, and present an opinion, not a fact. Hiring an expert does not equal paying for them to say what you want said. Experts can even switch sides when presented with all the data, and there are few, if any, laws preventing it. For some disciplines, the pool of experts is quite small. They may testify in favor of one project and against a similar project the next time. And of course, we see the famous diagram when one scientist only examines a small piece of an entire project. Each of these scientists comes up with a different conclusion. That brings us to the overview of the Texas ethics rules. I thought it would be beneficial for you to know a little something about the rules that all state agencies and board members operate under. The Texas Ethics Commission was created in 1991 and consists of 8 members. 4 are appointed by the governor, 2 by the lieutenant governor, and 2 by the speaker. The duties of the commission are to recommend the salary of the members of the legislature, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House. And of course, those are subject to voter approval. They set per diem rates for members of the legislature and the lieutenant governor, and they administer the following laws: the election code regarding political contributions, expenditures, and advertising, election of the speaker of the House, personal financial disclosures for and conduct of state officers and employees, and conflicts of interest involving the Texas Facilities Commission and the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. They also serve as the repository of required disclosure statements for state officials, and they provide training for state employees, members of the legislature, and other groups affected by the laws they administer. The Texas Ethics Commission regulates the TBPG and all members of the TBPG board. Each TBPG board member receives training regarding ethical practices for public office. We also receive and must file an annual personal financial statement. And some excerpts from the regulations for the TBPG board members follow. They may be helpful for you personally when you are faced with some ethical questions. So the personal financial statements are required annually for appointed officers and executive heads of state agencies, board members and executive heads of river authorities, office holders in and candidates for the Texas legislature, statewide elected officers, judges for courts of appeals, district judges, district or criminal district attorneys, members of the State Board of Education. Also required for former or retired judges sitting by assignment, and the state chair of any political party receiving more than 2% of the votes for the governor in the most recent general election. These personal financial statements ask the following: the name of your employer or employers, disclosure of investment holdings, so all mutual funds and stocks, including the profit and loss, disclosure of real property, so all the properties owned by you, your spouse, your dependent children, and you must include the profit or loss if sold, interests in business entities, and a substantial interest means owning a controlling interest or more than 10% of the voting interest or more than $25,000 of the market value of the entity. Gifts, trust income, including blind trusts, business associations, boards and executive positions, honorariums, fees received from lobbyists, and benefit of functions that honor public servants, and contracts with government entities. These personal financial statements are quite extensive. They also set standards of conduct for conflict of interest. State officers or employees should not accept or solicit any gift, favor, or service that might be reasonably identified to influence, accept other employment or engage in a business that would involve the disclosure of confidential information, accept other employment that it could impair independence of judgment, make personal investments that could create a conflict with public interest, or intentionally or knowingly solicit, accept, or agree to accept any benefit for exercising official powers or duties. The acceptance of benefits under this standard of conduct means a benefit that is anything reasonably regarded as pecuniary gain or pecuniary advantage. Benefits include honoraria, prohibitions on gifts by lobby statute or to state agencies, donations of gifts to charities, and bribery. Bribery includes soliciting, offering, or accepting a benefit in exchange for a decision, opinion, recommendation, vote, or other exercise of official discretion. Honoraria are payments given for professional services that are rendered nominally without a charge. Prohibited, accepting an honorarium where services are requested because of the officer's official position. And permitted, food, transportation, and lodging in connection with the speech if the services are performed that are more than merely perfunctory. And gifts. Most public servants are subject to one or more prohibitions on the acceptance of benefits. In an agency performing regulatory functions, a public servant may not accept a benefit from a person the public servant knows to be subject to the regulations, inspection, or investigation by the public servant or his or her agency. A public servant who exercises discretion with contracts, purchases, payments, claims, or other pecuniary transactions may not accept a benefit from a person known to be interested or likely to become interested in a transaction. For gifts, the prohibited things include things like a $50 clock, football tickets, a $160 rifle, or $60 restaurant meal. Things that are acceptable are non-cash items less than $50, food, lodging, transportation, or entertainment if accepted as a guest and the donor must be present, a gift from a friend, relative, or business associate with whom you have a relationship independent of your official status, a payment for legitimate consideration in a capacity other than that as a public servant, and certain gifts, awards, or mementos from registered lobbyists. When you do receive a gift, a public servant that receives an unsolicited benefit that you are prohibited from accepting may donate it to a government entity with authority to accept the gift, or a recognized tax-exempt charitable organization formed for educational, religious, or scientific purposes. For this last portion of the presentation, we're going to look at a few excerpts from the Professional Code of Conduct for the Texas Geoscience Practice Act. TBPG's purpose is to protect the health and safety of people and the environment. In addition to the rules regarding licensure and professional practice, TBPG is required to provide a code of professional conduct. It is provided in the Texas Administrative Code, Title 39, Chapter 851.101. It is binding on all license holders and gives TBPG the authority to impose sanctions. Additionally, it states that PGs and GIPs, those geoscientists in training, are responsible for understanding and complying with the Act, the TBPG rules, and any other law or rule pertaining to the practice of professional geoscience. It is important to note that it does not define a standard of care. This slide provides a listing of the rules under the Code of Conduct for your reference. This highlights reel is simply the information that's been summarized from the rules. In the event of a conflict, the rules supersede the information in this presentation. Under 851.102, competence and negligence, a PG or a firm shall be qualified by education and/or experience in the specific technical areas involved. Note that the rule clearly states that knowledge or skill is ordinarily applied by reasonably prudent PGs. To make this simple, signing or sealing work for which you are unqualified is incompetence. 851.103, recklessness. A PG or firm shall not practice geoscience that is reasonably likely to result in endangerment of the safety, health, or welfare of the public. This includes the disregard of substantial risk and failure to comply with the regs. Under 851.104, dishonest practice, a PG, GIT, or firm shall not defraud, deceive, or create a misleading impression. This includes advertising like LinkedIn or a company or personal website. TBPG sees many violations where a license has expired and yet the advertising for professional geoscience work and the letters PG have not been removed. TBPG generally sends a letter of advisement for these advertising violations when the individual works with us to remove these things quickly. The same section notes that a PG may not directly solicit, offer, give, or receive anything of significant value, including services. 851-105, conflicts of interest. This section requires a PG, firm, or GIT to disclose any business association or financial interest that might appear to influence judgment. You must inform your client in writing and receive written consent to continue the work. This section also mandates that PGs, firms, or GITs cannot accept financial consideration from more than one party in connection with a single project without full written disclosure to both parties, and this includes suppliers, contractors, and consultants. Many times, the PG that did a phase one for a seller will be asked to continue on the project by the buyer. You can do that, but you must have full written disclosure and agreement by all parties for you to continue on that project. 851-106, responsibility to the regulation of geoscience profession and public protection. This section specifies that a PG cannot knowingly participate in a plan to violate the TBPG Act or rules, aid or abet unlicensed practice, or fail to prevent associates or employees from violating the act or the rules. Further, a PG is held responsible for the use of their seal, signature, and other professional identification, and you must report a loss of your seal immediately to TBPG. That same section of the rules also requires reporting of known or suspected violations to TBPG. Additionally, PGs are required to keep records of the services they have provided for no less than 5 years. Lastly, a PG is required to look at the environmental impact of their actions, including conservation of resources and energy. TBPG welcomes the submission of these types of complaints. We are a complaint-driven agency, meaning we can't take action if we are not aware of a situation. Our complaint process relieves you of the burden of determining whether or not the information constitutes a violation. All you need to do is submit the information that you think may be a problem, and TBPG can take it from there. Under 851-107, prevention of unauthorized practice. PGs shall not practice in another jurisdiction. You cannot use the title professional geoscientist or PG unless your license is current, and GITs can't use their title or initials unless their renewals are current. Again, we welcome information concerning unlicensed practice. Your submittals of potential violations are key to maintaining the competency of the practice in the state of Texas. 851-108, criminal convictions. TBPG follows the Texas Occupations Code with regard to criminal convictions. TBPG can suspend or revoke a license or deny licensure for convictions. Licenses are automatically revoked upon felony incarceration. A person can apply for a new license if their previous license was revoked due to incarceration, but only after their release. 851-109, substance abuse. Again, TBPG follows the Texas Occupations Code regarding substance abuse. If substance abuse contributed to a violation of the TBPG Act or rules, then TBPG can require a rehabilitation program for the licensee. Substance abuse may be deemed gross incompetency, and TBPG may order examination by a licensed healthcare provider for diagnosis and treatments. 851-110, effective enforcement proceedings on application. TBPG cannot issue a license while there is a complaint pending, or if there is a complaint in another state and TBPG has been notified of that complaint. 851-111, professional geoscientists shall maintain confidentiality of clients. PGs can reveal confidential information only when they have fully informed consent of the client, or when it is required by law, or if the lack of disclosure would constitute a threat to the health, safety, or welfare of the public. 851-112, required reports to the TBPG. You as a PG are required to report changes in address, name, firm name, mailing address, etc. to the TBPG within 30 days of the change. Additionally, you are required to report a criminal conviction, not misdemeanors or traffic violations, and any disciplinary enforcement action taken against you by a licensing or certification body related to the practice of geoscience. Lastly, under 851.113, duty to abide by board order and timely pay administrative penalty. Administrative penalties must be paid within 30 days. Failure to pay or abide by the terms of a board order is grounds for yet another disciplinary action. Application for license or renewal can be denied until those penalties are paid. Any money submitted for a license or renewal will first be applied to any outstanding penalties. And here is the last slide, the contact information for TBPG. You can find it here. You can also find it on our website. And I would like to thank you for viewing this ethics presentation. We encourage you to comply with the TBPG rules by reporting substandard geoscience and practitioners to the TBPG. Complaints can be submitted anonymously. I'll close with just a couple of sayings. I'm sure you remember the phrase, dance like no one is watching. Well, when it comes to ethics, it's just the opposite. You must decide like everyone is watching.